Welcome to Book Club. As a child growing up, experiencing severe emotional violence, as a teenager, forced to flee across the paddocks to find safety, and as a young woman drawn towards unhealthy and dysfunctional relationships, your next guest has a story to tell that is all about making a difference. Her name is Jas Rawlinson. She's just published a new book. It's a memoir. It's called The Stories We Carry. And she says it's about rewriting shame into strength. And Jas Rawlinson, it is an absolute delight to have your company this afternoon. Hello.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me in.
It's quite a powerful statement, rewriting shame into strength. Just how therapeutic was it for you to write this story?
Oh, it was incredibly therapeutic, but also incredibly challenging. This is the fourth book that I've actually written and published, but without a doubt the most, I would say, most challenging in many ways, because it's the first time that I've gone into my full story in so much depth. But throughout the process, definitely very cathartic. So many memories, some that I'd actually forgotten about. And it wasn't until I was sort of forced to remember them by reading through half a dozen journals or so from my teen years that I actually worked through a lot of stories and issues and memories that I had forgotten about. And so I feel that statement is one that's very true, rewriting shame into strength. It's something that I've had to do throughout my journey, and something that I'm incredibly passionate about equipping others, especially youth, to understand as well, that they have that power.
What was it that brought you to a point where you felt you were able to, or the time was right to put your story down?
It's a good question, because I've spent a lot of the last 10 years being an advocate for many people with difficult stories, suicide survivors, trauma survivors. And I've kind of always been the cheerleader for so many other people. And I've definitely shared parts of my story over the years, and very vulnerably. But I got to this point, I think it was last year, where I just, we were still experiencing lockdowns here in Australia, and here in Brisbane, it definitely wasn't as bad as a lot of other parts of Australia or the world. But I still couldn't shake this hopelessness and distress that was following me around, when I thought about, how many other kids right now are going through what I went through, or how many are going through worse than what I experienced. How many women right now are stuck in abusive homes where they aren't actually even allowed to leave, or they feel they're unable to leave because of lockdown laws. And I just felt that it was so important to actually put my full story out there and write this book, and have it be a lifeline for those individuals who are where I used to be, and let them know that there is life on the other side of trauma, and that when they're ready, there's a lifeline here for them, or there's a stepping stone to take them through to the other side, and just give them that hope to keep going on.
You also talk about coming to a point where you realised what you had been through was domestic violence. What do you mean by that?
Well, it was actually in 2016, I just opened Brisbane's first domestic violence memorial, which isn't very far from the studio here. And I was talking to a lot of survivors around that time, as my friend Bonnie and I were preparing to open the memorial. And every time I'd have a conversation with someone who was a survivor, I just kept thinking, gosh, I'm so lucky that I never experienced that. Yes, I went through family violence as a child, but I never experienced, intimate partner violence. And it wasn't until sometime throughout that process, I must have started to read some stories about emotional abuse and the non-physical components of violence that we don't often hear about. And as I share in my book, it was like this carefully constructed narrative, or this house that I built inside my head, just started to crumble. And I went, oh my gosh, I never understood that the crossing of boundaries, especially in terms of sexual abuse and things like that, I never understood that they were all components of intimate partner violence. Because as a young woman, when I experienced these various traumas, I was, in my late teens, early 20s, And I thought that, domestic violence or intimate partner abuse was only punching, bruises, those sorts of things. And I thought that sexual violence could only occur, at the hands of a stranger. We think about this narrative that we're often told, or that we often see in popular, in pop culture, where somebody experiences rape or sexual violence, it's usually a stranger in an alley. And that's the fear that a lot of women have in particular growing up, is always trying to keep ourselves safe from that kind of what could happen when we're out in public by a stranger. But I never understood for so long that what I had experienced, particularly with one person who I call Blake in the stories we carry, had all the components of, well, it was rape, but it wasn't until actually earlier this year that I even started to call it that. I used to just kind of soften it and say sexual assault, crossing of boundaries, because I didn't feel I could call it that. And there were a lot of reasons for that. Part of it was the emotional abuse of that relationship I was in, where he wouldn't actually even call me his girlfriend for that period of almost 2 years. So it kind of took away from me the seriousness of everything he did, because I thought, well, that wasn't rape because I knew him, and it couldn't have been domestic violence because he
not
wouldn't
in a
call me his
relationship.
girlfriend.
Interesting. Yeah, okay. 20 minutes past 1 and Jas Rawlinson's with you. She's written a memoir, The Stories We Carry, about her experience with violence in many forms. It is a story that focuses on the truth of your experience and also pathways for anyone else who might be suffering, the message of hope, and also how to, as we've said, rewrite shame into strength. My name's Kat. How did you, if I can just take you back to your family, Jas, how did you and your mum experience life with your father? Can you set the scene for us a little bit?
Well, when I share my story, I often say, I was very lucky and very privileged in a lot of ways, and that also tied into why none of my friends really knew what was going on growing up. So to set the scene, we grew up in this beautiful little mountain valley on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. And, I had a horse. I still have that horse today. He's 37. And we had chickens and we had dogs. And, I went to a private school. Everything looked perfect. And lots of my female friends would say, oh my gosh, your dad's he's actually pretty cute. He's so charming. And everybody had a certain perception of me and my mum and our family. But the reality behind the scenes was very different. But for a child growing up in the 1990s with zero awareness or campaigns, no public campaigns about domestic violence or mental health, I certainly didn't have a name for what was happening in our house. And so the only way I could describe it was that around the age of 10 or 11, I remember walking around the playground and feeling as though there was this invisible force that was just pulling at my face, because that's how deeply embedded the sadness was and the hopelessness was. And it wasn't until I was in my maybe 13 or 14 that I even found out what chronic depression was, and I met the criteria for every single point. And yeah, every day was just about never knowing what kind of dad, or for my mum, what kind of husband she was coming home to. And so I describe it as this constant feeling of walking on eggshells. But it wasn't the fists and the punches and all those things that you would see if there were ever any campaigns, which made it very hard to understand. And sometimes he could be a wonderful father or husband. He might have a few good weeks where we went for quite a long time. And so, again, for my mum, it was very difficult because she had so many great memories with him, but then there was this violence and constant feeling of walking on eggshells and terror in the house. And that got a lot worse, really, from the age of 15 for me, was when Dad's mental health or whatever was going on for him really started to get worse. And by the time I was 18, it was, it was really terrible. And that was the period of time from when I was 16 to 18 where we did have to flee across the paddock one time to our neighbours and kind of force our way into their house and hide in there. And, there was a time that I called the police when I was about 16. but again, like all these things were things that I didn't tell anybody. And it wasn't until I was 16 that I told a single person that I knew. And it was my boyfriend at the time and my best friend. They were the only people I told. But by that time, I'd been carrying these secrets for about 6 years by myself.
Secrets that you've now thought deeply about and you have shared through your story. And I'm hearing a lot from you about the challenge in finding the right words to express what was going on in your life as these events were happening. 2022, we're in a slightly different place. The conversation is at a different place. I feel your book is a very important part of that conversation. By sharing your experience, maybe you're helping other people find words. Jas, what do you hope your story and the fact that you've shared it in book form, what do you hope it will achieve?
You're right. I mean, there's a lot that I want to achieve, and that's why I put the stories we carry out there, because first and foremost, I want survivors of trauma or those who are struggling with their mental illness to know that they're not alone, and that the most powerful thing they can actually do is to seek support for themselves. Because if my dad had felt that he could have sought support and that it wasn't weak for him to speak out, then he might still be here. That was the reason he took his life when I was 18, was he didn't feel that he felt it was weak as a man to seek support. And that's something I've heard from many people, particularly men, over the past, decade in my work as a mental health advocate and a advocate for domestic violence. So I want people to know that they're not alone. There are a lot of us that have gone through, some very difficult things in our life, and everyone has their own experiences. And I just, for anybody that's listening, especially if you are in a situation where you're in a toxic relationship of some sort, you deserve to be at peace and feel safe. And the most powerful thing that you might do is to speak up to a friend, and it could actually save your life. I can't stress that enough. We know that coercive control, which starts off as non-physical, patterns of intimidation, threat, control are the leading cause leading up to homicide. So a lot of survivors or victims at the time will think, well, it's not that bad, he just wants to know where I am, or she just wants to know where I am at all times, that, they control my finances, but that's not abuse. There's so many components to domestic violence that aren't physical, but they can lead to homicide and murder down the track. So, speak up, whether it's to a friend, whether it's a therapist, a helpline, get that support because you deserve it.
Jas Rawlinson, thank you very much for your time and sharing your story with us and in the book. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
On Book Club this afternoon here on ABC Radio, Brisbane and Gold Coast. My name's Kat, and you've been hearing from Jas Rawlinson. Her new book is called The Stories We Carry. And you can find out more at Jas's website. It's Jas Rawlinson, Jas spelled Jas, Rawlinson, Rawlinson, Jas Rawlinson, all one word, .com/the stories we carry.